Welcome back, and welcome to another quiet evening together. Tonight, we begin a long, slow journey backward through time, down beneath the stone floor of a medieval English abbey, in search of an answer to a quiet mystery that has been waiting in the dark for very nearly 500 years. It is the kind of mystery that does not shout. It does not appear in the bright pages of the schoolbooks. It is hidden, quite literally, beneath our feet, behind a wall of dressed stone that was built not to be opened, in a chamber that was sealed on a cold day in the 16th century by men who believed they were closing a door upon something precious, something sacred, and something that the world above was no longer fit to keep. There is a particular kind of silence that lives in a sealed place. You may have felt it yourself in the still air of an old church, or in the cool dark of a cellar that has not been disturbed in years. It is the silence of held breath, and tonight we are going to walk toward one such silence, down a worn stone stair, past the bones of the saints and the lead coffins of the abbots, to a wall that should not be there, in a crypt that was meant to stay closed forever. We are going to ask what an abbey was, and why it buried so much beneath its floors. We are going to ask what was hidden in the years when the old religious houses of England were torn down all at once, in one of the most dramatic and least understood upheavals this country has ever known. And we are going to ask the question that seems to hang in the air of every sealed chamber ever found, the question a great many of you have felt yourselves while watching stories like this one. Why does it always feel as though history is hiding far more than we were ever told? By the time we are finished tonight, that question will have an answer. Not a simple one, and not always the answer the storytellers would prefer, but a true one, and a stranger and richer one than the legend. Because the truth of the sealed crypts of England is not a tale of buried treasure and dark conspiracies, though there is treasure in it, and there is darkness too. It is a tale of faith and of fear, and of an entire spiritual world that was switched off almost overnight and walled up in the dark to wait. If you find comfort in these long, gentle journeys through the forgotten corners of history, please consider subscribing to the channel. It costs nothing at all, and it helps these slow, softly told stories find the people who need them most, the ones lying awake in the small hours, looking for a calm voice and an old story to carry them down into sleep. There is nothing you need to do tonight. There is nothing to solve and nowhere to be. You may drift off long before we reach the bottom of the stair, and that is perfectly all right, for the story will be here again whenever you return to it. So let the lights go low. Let your breathing slow. Let the weight of the day settle out of your shoulders and into the mattress beneath you. And stay with me, gently, as we go down into the dark. But before we descend, before we so much as touch that sealed wall, we must understand the building that stands above it. For you cannot understand a crypt until you understand the Abbey. And you cannot understand the Abbey until you understand the extraordinary world of the medieval English monastery. A world so different from our own that to step into it is to step almost onto another planet. A world of bells in the night and chanting in the dark. Of vast wealth and deliberate poverty, of learning and silence and the constant, patient nearness of death. That is where we must begin. Not in the crypt, but in the cloister. Not in the dark below, but in the cold, grey light of a monastery at dawn. 1,000 years ago, when the first bell of the day began to ring. So, let us go there now, together. Let us leave behind the world of clocks and screens and hurry, and let us walk in through the great gate of an English abbey, in the centuries when such places were the beating heart of the land. Let us see how these men lived, and why they built downward into the earth as well as upward toward heaven. And let us begin, very slowly, to understand what it was they were so determined to keep safe, in the dark, beneath the floor. Picture an English abbey in the year 1200. Not the broken, roofless ruin you may have visited on a grey afternoon, with the wind moving through empty windows, and sheep grazing where the high altar once stood. Picture it, instead, as it was, whole and alive and immense. For these were the largest buildings most people of the Middle Ages would ever see. A great abbey church could be longer than a modern football pitch and taller than anything for 100 miles around, its tower rising over the fields like a held note, visible to travellers a full day's walk away. To a peasant who lived in a low house of timber and thatch, who had never seen a building of more than one story, the sight of such a place, rising white and vast out of the river valley, must have seemed very nearly like a glimpse of heaven itself. And that, of course, was exactly the intention. An abbey was not simply a church, it was a whole world enclosed within walls, a self-contained community that might number anywhere from a dozen monks to several hundred, together with their servants, their workers, their guests, and the poor who came to their gate for bread. At its heart lay the cloister, a square walking place open to the sky in the middle and sheltered by covered walkways on every side. And around this cloister the whole life of the community was arranged. On one side, the great church. On another, the chapter house, where the monks met each morning to conduct their business and confess their faults. The dormitory, where they slept in a long communal room. The refectory, where they ate their plain meals in silence, while one of their number read aloud from a sacred book. The infirmary for the sick and the very old. The kitchens, the brewhouse, the bakehouse, the guest house, the library, the scriptorium where books were copied by hand. It was, in every meaningful sense, a small town devoted entirely to a single purpose. And that purpose was prayer. We must understand this because it is so foreign to the way we live now. The monks were not there to farm, though they farmed. They were not there to make beer, or copybooks, or tend the sick, though they did all of these things. They were there to pray, and specifically to pray without ceasing, on behalf of the whole world. The medieval mind held that the prayers of holy men had real and concrete power, that they could shorten the sufferings of the dead in purgatory, turn aside the wrath of God, and hold back the chaos that always pressed at the edges of a fragile world. A monastery was, in a sense, a great engine of prayer, running day and night, generation after generation, and the men who lived inside it had given up everything: family, property, freedom, the ordinary comforts of life, in order to keep that engine running. Their day was governed by the bell. 8 times in every 24 hours, the bell would call them to the church to sing the services that medieval people called the hours. They rose in the deep middle of the night, while the rest of the world slept, and went down a stone stair in the cold and the dark, half asleep, their breath clouding in the candlelight, to sing the night office in the great echoing church. They returned to their beds for a little while, then rose again before dawn. And so it went, through the whole turning of the day and the whole turning of the year, the same psalms, the same chants, the same slow and patient rhythm, repeated until the men themselves grew old and died, and were replaced by younger men who took up the same unending song. There were monasteries in England where that song had been sung, without a single night's silence, for 500 years and more. Now hold that image in your mind, because it matters for everything that follows. These were not careless places. They were the most ordered, most permanent, most deliberately eternal institutions in the whole of England. A king might reign for 20 years and die. A noble family might rise and fall in 3 generations, but an abbey was built to last forever, and very nearly did. It accumulated land and wealth and books and bones and memory, layer upon layer, century upon century. It was the bank, the library, the hospital, the hotel, and the cemetery of its district all at once. And it kept things. It kept charters and deeds going back to the time of the Saxon kings. It kept the bodies of its founders and its abbots and its benefactors. And it kept, above all, the relics of the saints, which were more precious to it than gold, and which it guarded with a care that bordered on the ferocious. To house all of this, the abbey did not only build upward, toward the light, it also built downward, into the dark, into the cool, and the silence and the permanence of the earth. And it is into that downward world that we must now go. For beneath the soaring church, beneath the singing and the candlelight, there was very often another church entirely, a lower church, a hidden one, a place of stone and shadow that the ordinary worshipper might never see, and that held the things the abbey valued most. We call it the crypt. And it is time now to go down. The word crypt comes down to us from the Greek, and it means quite simply hidden. A hidden place. And that is exactly what it was. In its oldest and purest form, the crypt was a chamber built beneath the floor of a church, usually beneath the high altar at the eastern end, where the most sacred part of the building stood. To reach it, you would step off the main floor of the church and go down a narrow flight of worn stone steps, often very steep and very dark, into a low vaulted room where the ceiling pressed close above your head, and the air was always cool and still, no matter the season. The crypt was the foundation of the holiness above. The church was built, quite literally and quite deliberately, upon it. Why build such a place at all? Why go to the enormous trouble of excavating and vaulting a stone chamber beneath a building that was already a marvel of engineering? The answer takes us to the very heart of medieval belief. A crypt was built to hold the dead, but not just any dead. It was built, above all, to hold the holy dead. For in the medieval understanding of the world, the bodies of the saints were not merely remains to be respectfully disposed of. They were something far more powerful. They were points of contact between this world and the next. A place where heaven touched the earth. Picture, if you will, the experience of descending into such a crypt as a medieval pilgrim. You have travelled perhaps for many days to reach this place. You are footsore and dusty and full of hope, for you have come in search of healing, or forgiveness, or simply the chance to draw near to something holy. You enter the great church, and a monk leads you toward the eastern end, and then down the narrow steps into the cool and the dark. Candles burn in the shadows. The air smells of stone and beeswax and old incense. And there, in the heart of the crypt, raised upon a stone base, or enclosed within a shrine of gold and silver and precious stones, lie the bones of the saint, the very bones, the actual physical body of a man or woman who, the church taught, was now in the presence of God, and who could, if properly entreated, carry your prayers directly to the throne of heaven. This is almost impossible for the modern mind to feel from the inside. But we must try, because without it, none of the rest makes sense. To the medieval pilgrim, those bones were not morbid, and they were not frightening. They were the most hopeful objects in the entire world. To be near them was to be near to power, to mercy, to the possibility of a miracle. People wept at the sight of them. They reached out to touch the shrine, to press their fevered children against the cold stone, to leave offerings of coins and candles and small wax models of the limbs they hoped would be healed. The crypt was not a place of death, in their understanding. It was the most alive place there was, and so the crypt became the treasure house of the Abbey in every sense. It held the relics, and relics were wealth, both spiritual and literal. A great relic could draw pilgrims by the thousand, and pilgrims brought offerings, and offerings built the soaring church above. The shrine of a popular saint could make an abbey rich beyond imagining. And so the relics were guarded and enshrined and surrounded with gold and jewels and kept in the deepest and most secure heart of the building, beneath the floor, behind locked grilles, in the cool and changeless dark. But the crypt held more than saints. Over the centuries, it filled with other dead as well. The founders of the Abbey, the great lords and ladies who had given the land and the money to build it, were often buried close to the holy bones, for it was believed that to lie near a saint was to gain some of the saint's protection on the dreadful day of judgment. The abbots, the men who had ruled the community in their lifetimes, were laid in stone coffins along the crypt walls. Bishops, benefactors, members of the royal house, all of them sought to be buried as close as possible to the sacred centre. And so, the lower church became a kind of stone library of the dead, the most important bodies of the district arranged in careful order around the bones of the saint, each one waiting, in faith, for the resurrection that the church promised would come at the end of all things. There were other underground spaces too, beyond the crypt proper. There were undercrofts, the great vaulted cellars beneath the monks' buildings, used for storage, for the keeping of wine and treasure and documents. There were tunnels and drains and hidden stairs. There were small chambers behind the altars where the most precious relics and the gold communion vessels were locked away. An abbey, seen from below, was a honeycomb of secret and sacred spaces, most of which the common people would never see, and many of which would be forgotten entirely once the men who knew them were gone. Hold that thought gently as we climb back up toward the light. Because the day was coming, though no one yet knew it, when all those men would be gone, all at once, and the doors to the dark would be shut. Before we go any further, we must pause and ask a question that the modern mind finds genuinely difficult, because the answer to it explains everything that follows. Why did the dead matter so much to these people? Why pour such wealth, such care, such devotion into the keeping of bones, the building of crypts, the burial of the great as close as possible to the holy? Why was the world beneath the church so crowded, so cherished, so utterly central to the life of the community above? To answer that, we have to understand the single most important fact about the medieval imagination, which is that for these people, death was not an ending. It was a doorway, and what lay beyond it was the most urgent reality of all. The medieval Christian believed, with a vividness we can scarcely recover, in the life of the soul after death, and in the long and frightening journey it had to make. Very few souls, it was thought, were holy enough to pass straight into heaven, and only the truly damned went straight to hell. The vast majority of ordinary people faced, after death, a third place, a place of purification called purgatory, where the soul was cleansed of the sins of its life through suffering, sometimes for a very long time before it could at last be admitted into the presence of God. Purgatory was real to these people, as real as France or the sea. It was a place their loved ones had gone to, and a place they themselves would go. And the sufferings of the souls there were terrible, and could last, it was feared, for hundreds or even thousands of years. But here was the crucial thing. The living could help the dead. The pains of a soul in purgatory could be shortened, eased, lifted by the prayers of those still on earth, and above all by the Mass, the central sacred rite of the Church, offered up on the soul's behalf. Every Mass said for a dead person was like a payment against the debt of their suffering, drawing them closer to release. And so, an entire vast economy of prayer grew up around the dead, the beating heart of medieval religion. The wealthy founded chantries, endowments that paid for priests to say Mass for their souls, sometimes daily, sometimes forever. They built chapels, gave lands, established whole institutions, all so that the prayers would continue after their death, and their time in purgatory would be eased. And the great engines of this prayer, the places where it was done most powerfully and most reliably, were the monasteries. This is why men and women of wealth and power were so desperate to be buried within the Abbey, and as close as possible to the holy relics. It was not vanity, or not only vanity, it was a calculation about the fate of their immortal souls. To be buried near a saint was to be under that saint's protection at the judgment. To be buried where the monks would walk past your tomb every day and remember you in their endless prayers was to ensure that your soul would not be forgotten, that the Masses would keep being said, that your suffering in purgatory would be eased by the constant, patient intercession of holy men. The crypt was not a morbid place. It was, in the most literal sense the medieval mind could imagine, the safest place to be buried in all the world. It was an investment in eternity. Now you can feel the full weight of what the Dissolution destroyed. It did not merely close some buildings and seize some land. It switched off the engines of prayer. It ended the Masses for the dead. It broke the chantries, scattered the monks, and severed, at a single stroke, the link between the living and the dead that had been the very centre of religious life for 1,000 years. To the people of the time, this was not a financial reform. It was the abandonment of their ancestors. It was the sound of the prayers falling silent, leaving the souls in purgatory to suffer on with no one left to ease them. Imagine believing that your dead parents were suffering in a place of cleansing fire, and that your prayers and your Masses were shortening their pain. And then watching the king's men ride up and shut the Abbey and forbid the Masses and turn out the monks who said them. That is the grief that lies beneath this whole story. That is why men wept, and why some hid what they could in the dark, and why the wound of the Dissolution went so deep and lasted so long. They were not only losing their abbeys, they were losing their dead. Let us linger a little longer in that world of relics, because it is the key that unlocks everything else, and because it is one of the strangest and most beautiful corners of the medieval imagination. To understand why an abbey would seal a chamber rather than surrender it, you have to understand just how precious the things in that chamber truly were, and why. A relic, in the simplest terms, was a physical object connected to a saint. Most often it was a part of the saint's own body: a bone, a tooth, a lock of hair, a withered hand, blackened with age, kept in a glove of gold. Sometimes a whole body, laid out in a shrine. But relics could also be objects the saint had touched, or things connected to the holy story itself. A scrap of cloth said to come from a martyr's robe, a splinter of wood claimed to be from the true cross, a phial of dust from the Holy Land, a thorn, a nail, a drop of something kept in crystal. The greatest abbeys competed with one another to assemble the most impressive collections, and a truly famous relic could put a monastery on the map of the whole of Christendom. We may smile at some of this now, and it is true that the trade in relics could shade into outright fraud, with the same saint's skull apparently residing in 3 different churches at once, and enough fragments of the true cross scattered across Europe to build a small ship. The medieval writers themselves joked about it, but the belief beneath the trade was utterly sincere, and to feel the period from the inside, you must take that belief seriously. People did not value relics because they were old or rare or beautiful, though they were often all three. They valued them because they believed, with their whole hearts, that the holy power of the saint remained present in them, that the bone of a saint was a kind of doorway through which prayers could pass upward and grace could flow downward. That to be near such an object was to stand, however briefly, in the borderland between earth and heaven. And so, relics were treated not as remains but as living presences. They were dressed in gold and jewels. They were carried in grand processions through the streets on the saint's feast day, while crowds wept and reached out to touch them. They were sworn upon in the most solemn oaths, for to lie with your hand upon the bones of a saint was to risk your very soul. They were believed to heal the sick, to protect the harvest, to turn back invading armies and quench fires and still storms at sea. A town that possessed the relics of a powerful saint believed itself to be under that saint's personal protection, and the loss or theft of such relics was a catastrophe of the first order, mourned like the death of a beloved ruler. The reliquaries that held these treasures were among the most magnificent objects the Middle Ages produced. Imagine a casket the size of a small chest, made of cedar and covered entirely in sheets of beaten gold, studded with sapphires and garnets and pearls the size of a thumbnail, its surfaces worked with tiny figures of saints and angels glittering in the candlelight of the crypt. Imagine arm-shaped reliquaries of silver, made to hold the bone of an arm, with the fingers raised in blessing. Imagine head-shaped reliquaries and tiny golden churches and crosses heavy with gems. The wealth poured into these objects was almost beyond counting, and all of it was concentrated in the dark heart of the Abbey, in the crypt and the treasury, behind locks and grills and walls of stone. Now you begin to see the shape of the thing. The crypt of a great abbey was not merely a burial place. It was a vault, in the fullest sense of the word, a strong room holding the most valuable objects in the entire region, both the gold reliquaries and the priceless relics within them. It held the bodies of the holy and the powerful. It held, in many cases, the abbey's documents and its accumulated treasure. And it was guarded by men who believed, absolutely, that these things were sacred, that they had been entrusted to their keeping by God and by the generations of monks who had gone before them, and that to lose them or to see them defiled would be a sin and a tragedy beyond words. Picture, then, what it would mean to such men to be told one day that all of this was to be taken away, that the relics they had guarded for centuries were to be declared worthless, even fraudulent, that the gold was to be melted down and carried off to a king's treasury, that the shrines were to be smashed, the bones scattered, the holy places emptied, and the doors thrown open. To us, looking back, it might seem merely like the confiscation of valuable property. To them, it would have felt like the end of the world, like watching the very gates of heaven being torn down and sold for scrap. That day was coming. But before it came, there was one more category of the dead that filled the dark places beneath and around the medieval church. And it is one that surprises many people when they first encounter it, for it was not only saints and abbots and lords who were kept beneath the abbey. In some places, the ordinary dead were kept there too, in their thousands, stacked and sorted and stored in a way that can stop a modern visitor in their tracks. To understand the full strangeness of the world beneath our feet, we must spend a little while now in the bone rooms, in the charnel houses and the ossuaries, in the places where England kept its skulls. There is a small medieval church in the town of Hythe, on the Kent coast, that holds one of the strangest sights in all of England. Beneath its chancel, in a vaulted chamber, there is a collection of human bones unlike almost anything else in the country. Along one wall, stacked with extraordinary care, there is a wall of human thigh bones, thousands of them laid end upon end like firewood. And above and around them, arranged on shelves, there are skulls, hundreds upon hundreds of skulls, perhaps 1,000 or more, gazing out with their empty sockets into the cool, dim air, as they have done for something like 700 years. This is an ossuary, a bone room, and the chamber at Hythe is the finest surviving example in England. To the modern visitor, it can seem macabre, even horrifying. But to the people who created it, it was nothing of the kind. To understand why, we have to understand the simple, pressing problem that every medieval community faced, and the gentle, faithful way in which they solved it. The problem was space. A parish church had a churchyard, a patch of consecrated ground in which the dead of the parish were buried. But a parish might use that same churchyard for many centuries, and the ground, however large, could only hold so many graves before it was full. And so, across the medieval world, a practical custom arose. After a body had lain in the earth for a generation or two, long enough for the flesh to return to the soil and only the clean dry bones to remain, those bones would sometimes be carefully lifted from the grave to make room for the newly dead. But you could not simply throw them away. These were Christian dead, baptized souls awaiting the resurrection, and their bones were to be treated with reverence, so they were gathered up, and they were stored, with care and with prayer, in a special building or chamber set aside for the purpose. A charnel house, an ossuary, a house of bones. Far from being a place of horror, the charnel house was a place of strange tenderness. The bones of the parish dead were kept together, all mingled, the rich beside the poor, the old beside the young, in a great democratic company of the departed. Prayers were said for them. In some places a chapel was built directly above or beside the bone store, so that Mass could be celebrated for the souls of all those whose remains lay below. The living and the dead of a parish remained, in this way, in constant company. A person walking into church on a Sunday morning might pass within a few feet of the carefully stacked bones of their own great-grandparents, and think nothing strange of it at all. Death was not hidden away in the medieval world, as we tend to hide it now. It was kept close, kept visible, woven into the daily fabric of life. There is another fine survival of this custom at Rothwell in Northamptonshire, where beneath the parish church lies a charnel chapel, filled with the neatly arranged bones of many hundreds of medieval people. It was lost and forgotten for a long time, and rediscovered, the story goes, quite by accident, when a gravedigger's spade broke through into the dark chamber below, and he found himself staring down into a room full of the silent dead. That image is worth holding on to, because it is one we will meet again and again in this story. The accidental breakthrough, the spade that goes too deep, the unexpected hollow beneath the floor, and the cool air rushing up, and the moment of realization that there is a hidden room down there full of things that no living person has seen for a very long time. The bone rooms tell us something important as we make our way toward the sealed crypt. They tell us that the world beneath the medieval church was densely, intimately populated. Beneath the floors and behind the walls there were saints and abbots, lords and bishops, and the mingled bones of countless ordinary parishioners, all kept close, all kept holy, all waiting in the dark. The medieval church was as much a building for the dead as for the living, perhaps more so. Its floors were paved with grave slabs, its walls were lined with tombs, its crypts and charnel houses held the accumulated dead of centuries. To walk into such a church was to walk into the company of everyone who had ever belonged to that place, the living kneeling above, the dead resting below, all of them part of a single great community that stretched across time. And all of it, every relic and every reliquary, every abbot in his stone coffin and every skull on its quiet shelf, every charter and every treasure and every holy bone, all of it belonged to a system. A vast, ancient, deeply rooted system of belief and wealth and memory that had grown in England for almost 1,000 years, since the first missionaries had come to these shores and the first monasteries had been founded in the age of the Saxon kings. It must have seemed to the men who lived inside it as permanent as the hills, as eternal as the stone, as certain as the rising of the sun. It was not. And the speed with which it ended is one of the most astonishing things in all of English history. In the space of a single decade, this entire world, every abbey and priory and friary in the land, more than 800 religious houses, was swept away. The monks were turned out. The treasures were seized. The buildings were stripped of their lead and their glass and left to fall into ruin. And the doors to the dark, the doors to the crypts and the vaults and the bone rooms were in many places simply shut and locked and walled up and left. To understand how that happened and why, we must now leave the quiet of the cloister and turn to the man who brought the whole of it crashing down. We must turn to the king. The king was Henry VIII, and the story of how he came to destroy the monasteries of England is one of the great turning points of our history. It is a story that is usually told from the top, from the level of kings and queens and great affairs of state, and we will tell it that way too, for a little while. But keep in mind, as we do, the crypt beneath the Abbey, and the monks who tended it, and the relics in their golden shrines. Because everything that happened in the palaces and the council chambers came rolling down, in the end, onto those quiet men and those sacred bones. The great events of history are never really abstract. They always arrive sooner or later at someone's door. For most of his reign, Henry was no enemy of the church. Quite the opposite. As a young king, he had even written a book defending the Catholic faith against the new ideas spreading out of Germany, and the Pope had rewarded him with a grand title, Defender of the Faith. A title that the monarchs of England, with a certain irony, still carry to this day. Henry heard Mass daily. He went on pilgrimage. He gave gifts to shrines. There was nothing in the young king to suggest that he would one day become the man who tore the old religion out of England by the roots. What changed everything was not, at first, a matter of faith at all. It was a matter of marriage and of a son. Henry was married to Catherine of Aragon, a Spanish princess, dignified and devout, who had given him a daughter but no surviving son. And Henry, who believed above all things that he needed a male heir to secure his dynasty and spare England the horror of another civil war, became convinced that his marriage was cursed, that it was displeasing to God, and that he must set Catherine aside and marry another, the sharp and dazzling Anne Boleyn. He needed the Pope to annul his first marriage, and the Pope, for a tangle of reasons both spiritual and political, would not. What followed was a slow, grinding collision between a king who was used to getting his way and a church that would not bend. And Henry, finding the door to Rome closed against him, did something that no English king had ever done. He decided that he did not need Rome at all. If the Pope would not grant him what he wanted, then he would simply remove the Pope from the equation. In a series of acts pushed through Parliament in the early 1530s, the link between England and Rome was severed, and Henry declared himself the supreme head of the Church in England. At a stroke, the king became the master of the Church within his own realm, and the monasteries, which had always looked ultimately to Rome, and to their own ancient independence, suddenly found themselves answerable to a monarch who needed money, who distrusted their loyalty, and who had just discovered that there were no longer any limits on what he could do to them. For the monasteries were rich, extraordinarily rich. Over the centuries they had accumulated something like a quarter or even a fifth of all the land in England. They held vast estates, thousands of manors, mills and fisheries and whole towns. Their barns were full, their coffers were deep, and their crypts, as we have seen, glittered with gold. To a king who was perpetually short of money, who dreamed of war with France and Scotland, and of a treasury to match his ambitions, the wealth of the monasteries was a temptation almost beyond bearing. And now, as supreme head of the church, he had both the power and, he could tell himself, the right to take it. The justification was provided by the spirit of the age. These were the years of the Reformation, when reformers across Europe were attacking the old church for its corruption, its wealth, its superstition. And there was corruption to attack. Some monasteries had grown lax and worldly. Some monks lived comfortably, far from the austere ideals of their founders. The cult of relics, in particular, was an easy target, for it was riddled with frauds, the duplicate skulls, and the endless fragments of the cross, and the reformers heaped scorn upon it as a swindle practiced upon the gullible poor. Whether Henry himself believed all of this is hard to say. But it gave him exactly the cover he needed. He could present the seizure of the monasteries not as a robbery, but as a reform. Not as the plundering of holy places, but as the cleansing of corrupt ones. And so, in the year 1535, the king's chief minister, a hard and brilliant man named Thomas Cromwell, set in motion the machinery that would bring the whole 1,000-year-old system down. He sent out commissioners across the length and breadth of England, men with sharp eyes and sharper pens, to visit every religious house in the land. They were to record everything: the value of the lands, the contents of the treasuries, the number of monks, and with particular and pointed attention, every fault and failing and scandal they could find or invent. It was an inventory, and it was an indictment, and it was the beginning of the end. The commissioners were coming. They would walk in through the great gates that had stood open for centuries. They would demand the keys to every room, and in time they would demand the keys to the crypt. When the commissioners came, they came first to the smaller houses. In the year 1536, an Act of Parliament dissolved all the religious houses whose income fell below a certain modest line, several hundred of them in a single stroke, on the stated grounds that the smaller monasteries had fallen into vice and idleness and would be better swept away. The monks and nuns of these houses were given a choice that was hardly a choice at all. They could transfer to one of the larger surviving monasteries, or they could accept a small pension and return to the world they had renounced. Their houses were closed. Their goods were inventoried and carried off. Their lands passed to the crown, and from the crown, soon enough, into the hands of the gentry and the merchants who were eager to buy them. For the people of England, this was a shock that ran far deeper than the king and his ministers had expected. We must remember that the abbeys were not distant institutions to the ordinary man and woman. They were woven into the fabric of daily life. The abbey was the landlord, the employer, the almsgiver, the keeper of the local shrine, the place where you went to pray for your dead and to seek help when the harvest failed. It was where your parents and grandparents were buried. It held the holy relics that protected your district. And now, suddenly, strange men were riding up to its gates with documents from London, turning out the monks, pulling the lead from the roofs, and carting the contents away. To many people, it felt like sacrilege. It felt like the world being turned upside down. In the north of England, that feeling boiled over into open rebellion. In the autumn of 1536, tens of thousands of people rose up in a great protest movement that came to be called the Pilgrimage of Grace, marching beneath banners showing the wounds of Christ, demanding, among other things, that the monasteries be restored and the old religion protected. For a few tense weeks, it seemed as though the rising might genuinely threaten the king. But Henry was cunning and merciless. He made promises he had no intention of keeping, waited for the rebellion to disperse, and then took a terrible revenge, executing its leaders and many ordinary participants, hanging men from the trees and the church towers of the north as a warning to all who might think of resisting again. The message was unmistakable. The dissolution would go forward, and anyone who stood in its way would be destroyed, and go forward it did, with a gathering momentum that soon swept up not just the small houses, but the greatest abbeys in the land. For the king and Cromwell had tasted the wealth of the monasteries now, and they wanted all of it. Through the years 1538 and 1539, the commissioners moved methodically from one great house to the next, pressuring the abbots and their communities to surrender, to sign away their ancient foundations and hand over the keys. Some resisted. Most, seeing the fate of those who fought and the hopelessness of their position, gave in. They were offered pensions, the abbots often quite generous ones, and in exchange they signed the deeds of surrender that ended communities which had existed for 500, 600, 700 years and more. One by one, the light went out across the spiritual landscape of England. It is worth pausing to feel the scale of this. We are not talking about the closure of a few institutions. We are talking about the deliberate, systematic destruction, within the span of about 4 years, of more than 800 religious houses, the dissolution of a way of life that reached back to the very dawn of Christianity in Britain, and the seizure of perhaps a fifth of the wealth of the entire kingdom. There has rarely been a transfer of property so vast and so sudden in the whole of English history. Whole libraries, accumulated over centuries, were broken up and scattered, their priceless manuscripts sold for scrap, used to wrap fish or polish boots or stiffen the bindings of other books. Knowledge that had been preserved since the age of the Saxon kings was lost in a matter of months. And the great churches themselves, the soaring masterpieces of medieval engineering, were stripped of everything of value and abandoned to the weather and the local people, who carted away the stone to build their barns and their houses. But the destruction was not only of buildings and books, it was also of the sacred heart of the old religion, the relics and the shrines. And it is here that our story turns back toward the crypt and toward the dark. For when the commissioners reached the great houses, they did not stop at the treasury and the granary. They went, in time, to the shrine of the saint. They went down into the crypt, and what they did there, and what some of the monks did in response, in the last desperate days before the doors were shut, is the heart of the mystery we came here to explore. To understand it, we have to stand in the crypt on one of those final days and watch the lamplight, and feel the fear as the men who had guarded the holy dead for a lifetime realized that their world was ending, and asked themselves a terrible question. What could still be saved? And what must be hidden before it was too late? Not everyone surrendered quietly, and the fate of those who resisted casts a hard light across this whole story, for it shows us exactly what the men who hid their treasures in the dark were so afraid of. Among the very first to refuse the king's demands were the Carthusians of the London Charterhouse, and their story is one of the most harrowing of the entire age. The Carthusians were the strictest and most austere of all the monastic orders, men who lived almost as hermits even within their community, each in his own small cell, in near perpetual silence, devoting their whole lives to prayer and solitude. They were widely regarded, even by their critics, as genuinely holy, the least corrupt and most sincere of all the religious in England. And it was precisely these men, the best of them, who would not bend. When they were required to swear an oath accepting the king as supreme head of the church, in place of the Pope, their prior, a gentle and respected man named John Houghton, could not in conscience do it. To him it was a betrayal of God himself. The king's response was merciless, and it was meant to be. In the spring of 1535, Houghton and 2 other Carthusian priors were arrested, tried for treason, and condemned to the most horrific death the law allowed. They were dragged through the streets of London on hurdles, still in their monastic habits, to the gallows at Tyburn. There they were hanged, but cut down while still living, and then disembowelled and quartered, their bodies hacked into pieces and displayed about the city as a warning. Houghton's arm, it is said, was nailed up over the gate of the very Charterhouse he had led. These were not soldiers or rebels. They were contemplative monks who had spent their lives in silence and prayer, and they were butchered for refusing to swear a single oath. And the horror did not end there. Other monks of the London Charterhouse continued to resist, and the king's government, rather than execute them all publicly, chose a slower and quieter cruelty. A number of them were simply chained upright in a foul prison and left there, without proper food or care, to die slowly of starvation and disease over the course of many weeks and months. One by one, in the dark and the filth, these holy men perished until almost the whole community had been destroyed. It was a death deliberately designed to be hidden, unspectacular, and total, the erasure of an inconvenient conscience by the simple expedient of letting men rot. Hold this in your mind alongside the image of the monks in the crypt, building their wall by candlelight. This is what they knew was coming. This is the power they were trying, in their small and desperate way, to keep their treasures safe from. Not a polite confiscation, but a regime that would hang and disembowel holy men in their habits, and starve contemplatives to death in chains, that would tear down in a few years what had been built over 1,000, and crush without mercy anyone who stood in its way. When we imagine the ceiling of those chambers, we must imagine it under this shadow. The men who built those walls were not hiding gold out of greed. They were trying to save what was sacred to them from a power that had already shown exactly how far it was willing to go. Their fear was not imagined. It was the entirely rational fear of people who had seen the best among them destroyed, and who knew that nothing now was safe. And against that power, in the end, the walls and the hidden chambers were almost the only resistance left. A community could not fight the king's armies. It could not defy his commissioners or reverse his acts of parliament. But it could, in the last hours, take the holiest things it possessed down into the dark and seal them away, and trust them to the earth and to God and to some better future. It was the resistance of the powerless, the only defiance available to men who had lost everything else. And it is why, scattered across England in the foundations of the broken abbeys, there may still be small sealed pockets of the medieval world, hidden not out of greed but out of love and terror in the last days before the darkness came down. The destruction of the great shrines was, in many cases, a deliberate and very public act. The most famous shrine in all of England was that of St. Thomas Becket at Canterbury, the archbishop murdered in his own cathedral in the 12th century, whose tomb had drawn pilgrims from across Europe for more than 300 years. It was a mountain of gold and jewels, heaped up by the offerings and the gratitude of countless thousands. In the autumn of 1538, the king's men came for it. They stripped it to the ground. The gold and the gems were carried off in great chests, the spoils said to fill many wagons, and the bones of the saint himself. The bones that had been venerated for centuries were, by most accounts, scattered or burned, so that no trace of the cult would remain. Becket was formally declared to be no saint at all, but a traitor, and his name was ordered to be scratched out of every prayer book in the land. This was the pattern that played out in greater or lesser degree at shrine after shrine across the country. The reliquaries were broken up for their gold. The jewels were prized out and sent to the king's treasury. And the holy bones, the relics that had been the spiritual heart of these places for centuries, were in many cases simply discarded, thrown out, lost, or destroyed, treated now not as sacred treasures, but as the worthless props of a discredited superstition. For the monks who had spent their lives in the service of these relics, who had sung to them in the dark of every night, and tended them as living presences, the sight of the commissioners tearing the shrines apart and casting the holy bones into the rubbish must have been almost beyond enduring. The greatest and most terrible of these endings came at Glastonbury in the west of England, one of the oldest and richest abbeys in the kingdom, a place wrapped in legends that reach back, it was said, to the very beginnings of Christianity in Britain. Its abbot, an old man named Richard Whiting, refused to surrender his house willingly, and so the king's men dealt with him as a warning to all the rest. He was arrested, tried on charges that were almost certainly trumped up, and in the autumn of 1539 he was dragged on a hurdle to the top of the great hill that overlooks the Abbey, the Glastonbury Tor, and there he was hanged, and his body was cut down and quartered, and his head was set above the gate of his own ruined monastery. He was nearly 80 years old. With his death, one of the most ancient religious houses in the Western world came to an end, and its lands and treasures passed to the crown. Now, picture the position of the monks in such a house in the final weeks and months before the end. They knew what was coming. The news travelled. They had heard of the stripping of Canterbury, of the surrenders forced upon their neighbours, of the fate of the abbot of Glastonbury. They knew that the commissioners would come, that the shrines would be broken, that the relics would be cast out, that everything they held sacred would be seized and scattered and defiled. And they faced a choice that we, looking back, can only imagine. Should they simply surrender everything? Or should they try, in whatever small way they could, to save something, to hide the most precious relics, the holiest bones, the most sacred objects, somewhere the king's men would not find them? To wall up a chamber, to seal a vault, to bury a reliquary beneath the floor, in the hope that one day, when the madness had passed, the old religion would return, and the hidden treasures could be brought back into the light. We know that some of them did exactly this. The historical record, scattered and fragmentary as it is, contains many hints and traditions of monks hiding what they could, of relics smuggled out and kept secretly by faithful families for generations, of precious objects buried in the grounds or sealed within the fabric of the buildings, of communities that, in their final days, took their most sacred possessions down into the crypt and hid them, walling up a doorway, concealing a chamber, trusting the dark to keep safe what the world above could no longer protect. Some of these hidden things were later recovered. Some, almost certainly, never were, and lie still, somewhere, in the foundations of ruined abbeys across England, waiting in a darkness that has now lasted nearly 500 years. It is from this true and well-documented impulse, the desperate hiding of sacred things in the last days of the monasteries, that all the legends of the sealed crypt ultimately spring. Not from fantasy, but from a real and human and heartbreaking act repeated in some form at house after house across a frightened and grieving land. And so let us go down now into one such crypt on one such night, and let us imagine, as truly and as gently as we can, what it might have been to be there, to be one of the last monks of a dying abbey, kneeling in the lamplight beside the bones of the saint, with the king's men due to arrive in the morning, and a wall to build before they came. Picture it then, a night in the late autumn of 1539. The abbey is quiet, but it is not the ordinary quiet of the night office. It is a different silence, taut and frightened, the silence of men who know that their world is about to end. Word has come that the commissioners will arrive within the week, perhaps within days. The abbot has been told that surrender is the only path that does not lead to the gallows. The younger monks are weeping in the dormitory. The older ones sit in the cold, staring at nothing, their whole lives undone. And down in the crypt, by the light of a few low candles, a small group of them has gathered to do one last thing. The chamber is cool and close, as it always is, the air heavy with the smell of stone and old incense. The candlelight flickers across the carved faces of the abbots in their tombs, along the walls, across the worn steps, across the shrine at the centre, where the bones of the saint have lain for so many centuries. These men have known this room their whole adult lives. They have come down these steps in the deep of every night, half asleep, to sing to the holy dead. They know every shadow of it. And now they have come down for the last time, with a different purpose. What they carry with them, we can only imagine, but we can imagine it well, because we know what such men treasured. Perhaps the most sacred of the relics, wrapped in linen and placed in a plain box, stripped now of its golden shrine so that it will not tempt the looters. Perhaps the great gospel book of the house, ancient beyond reckoning, its pages illuminated in gold by the patient hands of monks dead for 500 years. Perhaps a chalice, a cross, the founder's charter, the small and priceless things that are the very soul of the community. And perhaps simply the decision to seal the chamber itself, to wall up the entrance to the crypt so that the holy dead within, the saint and the abbots and the founders, will not be disturbed and scattered by the men who are coming. And so they work through the night, in the cold and the candlelight. Stone by stone, they build a wall across the entrance, or they conceal a doorway behind a slab, or they lower their treasures into a space beneath the floor and seal it over. They do it carefully, lovingly, with the same devotion they have given to everything in this place. And perhaps, when it is done, they kneel before the new-built wall and pray, not in despair, but in hope. For they do not believe, surely, that this is forever. They believe that the king's madness will pass, as such things always pass, that a new and faithful ruler will come, that the old religion will be restored, and that one day, in a year or in 10 years, faithful hands will take down this wall and bring the holy things back into the light, and the bells will ring again, and the song that has never ceased will begin once more. They are wrong. That is the quiet tragedy at the heart of this story. The day they are waiting for will not come, not in their lifetimes, and in most cases, not ever. The old monastic world is not paused, it is ended. The men who built that wall will die in exile, scattered to parishes and pensions and graves far from the home they loved. And the chamber they sealed with such care and such hope will not be opened by faithful hands in a year or in 10 years. It will simply be forgotten. The abbey above it will fall into ruin. The knowledge of what lies below will pass out of living memory, and the sealed crypt will keep its silence and its secret for century after century after century, until one day, long after everyone who ever knew of it is dust, a stranger's spade or a builder's pick will break through into the dark, and the cool, still air of 1539 will come sighing up into the modern world. This, then, is how the sealed chambers were truly made. Not by conspiracy, not by dark and ancient orders guarding forbidden secrets, but by ordinary, frightened, faithful men in the last hours of a dying world, trying to save the things they loved from destruction, and trusting the dark to keep them until a better day that never came. It is a far sadder story than the legends, and a far more human one. And it leaves us with a landscape all across England, scattered with ruined abbeys, beneath and within which there may still be spaces that were closed in those final, desperate years and never properly reopened. But before we go looking for what was found when some of those spaces were breached, we must spend a little while in the long silence that followed, in the centuries of forgetting, in the slow ruin of the great houses and the strange afterlife of their bones. What became of the men who built those walls, once the walls were built and the doors were shut, and the abbey was no longer theirs? It is a question we rarely ask, because the monks tend to vanish from the story the moment their houses fall, as though they simply evaporated along with the world they had served. But they did not evaporate. They were real men, thousands upon thousands of them, and they walked out of the gates of their dissolved monasteries into a world that no longer had any place for them. And they had to find a way to live. For most, the immediate blow was softened by money. The government, anxious to avoid creating a vast army of destitute and resentful holy men, granted pensions to the dispossessed monks, and to the senior figures these pensions could be quite comfortable. An abbot might receive a generous income for the rest of his life, but for the ordinary monk the pension was small, often barely enough to live on, and it came with a deep and disorienting loss that no money could repair. These were men who had given up family, property, and worldly ambition, who had expected to live and die within the walls of their community, singing the same songs in the same choir until they were laid to rest in the same ground as their brothers. They had built their entire lives, their very identities, around the permanence of the monastic world, and now that world was simply gone, and they were turned out into a society they had deliberately left behind, often many years before, with no home, no family, no trade, and no place. Some found a way back into the religious life that survived. The Dissolution destroyed the monasteries, but it did not abolish the church in England, and a number of former monks became parish priests, serving in ordinary village churches, bringing the learning and the devotion of the cloister into the everyday life of the countryside. Others, released from their vows, did the thing that would have been unthinkable in their former lives. They married. They raised families, men who had taken vows of celibacy in their youth, expecting to keep them until death, found themselves in middle age, building the ordinary domestic lives they had once renounced, a strange and surely bewildering reversal. Others drifted, struggled, fell into poverty, or simply disappeared into the anonymous mass of the population, their names and their fates lost to us entirely. And what of their memory of the world they had lost? We can only imagine it, but we can imagine it well. These were men who carried within them the detailed, intimate knowledge of their vanished houses, who remembered the crypts and the shrines, the hidden chambers and the sealed vaults, the things that had been concealed in the final days. For a generation, that knowledge lived on in their minds, in the memories of the surviving monks scattered across the country. An old former monk, sitting by the fire in his parish house or his married home, might still remember exactly where the relics had been hidden, exactly which doorway had been walled up, exactly what lay sealed beneath the floor of the ruined church across the valley. The map of the underground world survived, for a little while, in living memory. But living memory does not last. The old monks grew older, and they died, one by one, the last men who had sung in the great choirs, the last who knew where the secrets were hidden. And as they died, the knowledge died with them. There was no one to write it all down, no one to pass it on, no reason in the harsh new world to preserve the locations of hidden Catholic treasures that it was now dangerous even to speak of. And so, gradually, over the span of a single long lifetime, the precise knowledge of what had been hidden and where faded out of the world entirely. The sealed chambers passed from being deliberately hidden to being remembered only by a dwindling few, to being utterly forgotten. The last monk who knew the secret took it with him into his grave, and after that, the dark kept its contents not against the king's commissioners, but against the simple, total forgetting of all mankind. What happened to the great abbeys after the monks were gone is, in its own way, as strange and as sorrowful as the dissolution itself. For these enormous, beautiful, sacred buildings did not vanish overnight. They were too vast for that. Instead, they died slowly, over decades and even centuries, picked apart piece by piece, until in most cases only fragments remained. The process began with the most valuable and portable thing of all, the lead. The roofs of the great churches were covered in tons of it, and lead was worth money. So the king's men, and then the new owners, sent workmen up onto the roofs to strip the lead away and to melt it down on the spot in great fires fed, often enough, by the carved wooden choir stalls and the painted screens and the holy images that had filled the church. Imagine that scene. The roof of a building that had stood for 400 years being torn open to the sky, while in the nave below, the masterpieces of generations of craftsmen were burned as fuel to melt the metal that had sheltered them. Once the roof was gone, the rest followed inevitably. Rain poured into the open church. Frost cracked the stone. Timbers rotted and fell. And the local people, who had perhaps watched the destruction with horror at first, came in time to see the ruin as something more practical, a vast and convenient quarry of dressed stone, free for the taking. Why cut and haul new stone from a distant hillside when there was a mountain of beautifully worked masonry standing roofless and ownerless in the next valley? And so, year by year, the abbeys were carted away. The stones of holy walls became the walls of barns and farmhouses and field boundaries. Whole villages were built, in some places from the bones of a single dismantled monastery. If you walk through the countryside near a ruined abbey today and look closely at the old buildings, you will often see, set into a farmhouse wall or a garden rockery, a fragment of carved tracery, a piece of a window, a worn stone face, the scattered remnants of a great church living on, unrecognized in the fabric of ordinary life. The great estates, meanwhile, passed into new hands. The king sold the monastic lands, or granted them to his favourites and his servants, and a whole new class of landowners rose up on the foundations of the old religious houses. Some of them pulled down the abbey buildings entirely and built grand new mansions on the site, sometimes incorporating parts of the old structure. A cloister turned into a courtyard, a refectory turned into a great hall, a monk's dormitory turned into a gallery. Others simply let the ruins stand and farmed around them. And in this way, the physical memory of the monasteries was both destroyed and, here and there, strangely preserved, embedded in the new world that grew up on their graves. But here is the thing that matters most for our story. As the buildings fell, and the land changed hands, and the generations passed, the detailed knowledge of these places, the intimate knowledge that the monks had held, began to fade away. The men who had known every chamber and stair and hidden vault were gone, dispersed and dead. The new owners knew the buildings only as ruins or as raw material. They had no reason to know, and no way of knowing what lay sealed beneath the rubble-strewn floors, what doorways had been walled up in the final days, what chambers had been concealed and forgotten. The map of the underground world, which had lived only in the minds and the customs of the monastic community, simply died with that community, and so the sealed places passed into a deeper darkness still. It was no longer that they were hidden and known to be hidden. It was that they were hidden and forgotten entirely, their very existence erased from human memory. A crypt that had been deliberately walled up in 1539, in the full knowledge of the men who built the wall, became by 1639 simply a solid-seeming patch of foundation that no one had any reason to question. By 1739, it was buried beneath a century of fallen stone and grown over earth, in a ruin that the local people walked past every day without a second thought. The secret was no longer being kept. It had simply been lost. This is the long silence at the center of our story, and it is worth dwelling in for a moment, gently, before we move on. For there is something both melancholy and strangely peaceful in the thought of it. All across England, through all those centuries, while the world above churned through its wars, and its kings, and its revolutions, through the rise and fall of empires, and the slow turning of the seasons, these small, sealed pockets of the medieval world simply waited, undisturbed, unremembered, holding their cool, still air and their silent contents exactly as they had been left on a frightened night long ago. A bubble of the year 1539, preserved intact in the dark, while 500 years rolled over the ground above, and waiting, though no one knew it, for the day when the forgetting would end, and someone, by accident or by design, would finally break back through into the dark. The ending of the forgetting came slowly, and it came with a change in the way people thought about the past. For a long time after the dissolution, the ruins of the monasteries were simply there, unloved and unregarded, useful only as quarries and grazing for sheep. But as the centuries passed, and especially as the 1700s gave way to the 1800s, a new kind of feeling began to grow in England. People began to look at the broken abbeys, not with indifference, and not with the old reforming contempt, but with a kind of wistful fascination. The ruins became romantic. Poets wrote about them. Painters set up their easels among the fallen stones and captured the ivy-clad arches in the golden light of evening. Gentlemen of leisure began to take an interest in the history of these places, to dig among the foundations, to puzzle over the old documents, to ask what had stood here, and who had lived here, and what might still lie beneath. These were the antiquarians, the forerunners of the modern archaeologist, and we owe them a great deal, even if their methods would horrify a careful excavator today. They were curious, enthusiastic, sometimes reckless men who loved the past and wanted to uncover it, but who often did real damage in their eagerness, smashing through walls, emptying tombs, carrying off bones and objects with little record of where they had been found. And it was very often these men, or the workmen they employed, or simply ordinary labourers going about ordinary work, who made the first breakthroughs into the long-sealed dark. For the rediscovery of a hidden chamber is, far more often than the legends suggest, an accident. It is rarely the dramatic moment of the treasure hunter following an ancient map. It is, instead, the mundane and astonishing moment of the workman whose pick goes through into nothing. A gravedigger deepening a grave in an old churchyard, who suddenly feels the soil give way beneath his spade and finds himself looking down into a stone-vaulted room full of bones. A builder repairing the floor of an ancient church, who lifts a slab he expected to be solid and feels the cold air rising from a stair that leads down into the dark. A farmer ploughing a field where an abbey once stood, whose plough strikes stone, and who digs to clear it and uncovers the top of a buried doorway. Again and again, across the centuries, this is how the sealed places have given up their silence, not with drama, but with a quiet, almost domestic surprise. The floor that is not solid, the wall that is not the end, the cold breath of old air sighing up out of the dark, carrying the smell of a world that has been waiting a very long time. And when such a breakthrough happened, and a forgotten chamber was opened at last, what did people find? This is the question at the very heart of our journey, the question that the legends answer one way and the truth answers another. The legends, of course, promise treasure and mystery, gold and forbidden secrets, things so dangerous or so wonderful that they had to be hidden away forever. The truth is usually quieter than that, and sometimes it is more wonderful for being quiet. For what the sealed chambers of England most often held was not gold. It was the dead. It was the bones of the holy and the powerful, lying just as they had been left. It was lead coffins, sealed and heavy, with their occupants preserved within in strange and sometimes startling condition. It was the worn stone of crypts that had not seen the light for centuries. It was, in short, the medieval world itself, caught and held in the amber of the dark, waiting to be looked upon by eyes that had forgotten it ever existed. To see what this truly meant, and to ground our story at last in the solid earth of real and well-documented discovery, we must now leave the realm of the imagined sealed crypt and go to a handful of real places, real churches, and real abbeys where genuine hidden chambers were found, and where you yourself can still go and stand today and feel the cool air of the medieval dark on your own face. For the most remarkable thing about this whole story is that you do not need to take any of it on faith. The sealed crypts of England are not only legend, some of them are real, and they survive, and they have given up extraordinary things. Let us begin with the most astonishing of them all. In a quiet town in the far north of England, where in the year 1725 a group of workmen, going about an ordinary job, broke through a floor and found themselves descending into a chamber that had been built more than 1,000 years before by one of the greatest churchmen in the history of Saxon Britain. Let us go to Hexham. In the town of Hexham, in Northumberland, there stands an ancient church, and beneath that church there is a crypt that is one of the great treasures of early English history. It was built in the 7th century, around the year 674, by St. Wilfrid, one of the most powerful and ambitious churchmen of the Saxon age, a man who had travelled to Rome and come back determined to build, in the wild north of England, churches as grand as any he had seen on the continent. The crypt he built at Hexham was a small, deep, stone-vaulted chamber designed to hold the holy relics he had brought back from his travels and to allow pilgrims to file down into the sacred dark, view the relics through openings, and climb back up again, changed by their nearness to the holy. And here is the truly remarkable thing about it. Wilfrid built his crypt, in part, out of the stones of an even older world. For Hexham lies close to the line of Hadrian's Wall, the great Roman frontier, and the Roman towns and forts along that wall had been abandoned for centuries by Wilfrid's time, their dressed and squared stones lying ready to hand. So the Saxon masons carried those Roman stones to Hexham and built them into the crypt, and some of them still bear their Roman carvings and inscriptions, the names of long-dead Roman officials, fragments of monuments to forgotten soldiers, hidden away in the fabric of a Christian holy place. To descend into the Hexham crypt is to descend through two layers of the deep past at once, the Saxon and the Roman, folded together in the dark. For a long time, this extraordinary chamber was utterly lost. The great medieval church that had grown up around Wilfrid's foundation went through its own troubles, and the crypt was buried, sealed beneath the floor, its existence forgotten for centuries. And then, in the year 1725, workmen digging in the church, doing the ordinary work of repair and foundation, broke through into a hidden space. They had found Wilfrid's crypt, intact, more than 1,000 years after it was built, a perfect and astonishing survival from the dawn of English Christianity. Today, you can go to Hexham and descend those same narrow steps into that same low chamber and stand surrounded by stones that were quarried by Roman hands and laid by Saxon ones in a holy place that was lost to the world for the better part of 1,000 years. It is one of the most moving experiences that the English past has to offer, and it is entirely real. Hexham teaches us something important. It shows us that the sealed and forgotten chamber is not a fantasy. It is a genuine feature of this country's buried history, a real thing that has happened, again and again, in real places, and it shows us the particular shape of the wonder these places offer. The wonder of Hexham is not gold or treasure. It is age. It is survival. It is the almost unbearable intimacy of standing in a space made by human hands 13 centuries ago, and touching the same stones those hands touched, and feeling the same cool dark they meant you to feel. The sealed crypt, when it is opened, gives us not riches, but contact. A direct, physical, breathtaking line of connection to people who have been dust for more than 1,000 years. And Hexham is not alone. The story of the rediscovered Saxon crypt repeats elsewhere, and nowhere more hauntingly than at a quiet village church in the Midlands, at a place called Repton, where beneath the floor there lies a chamber that was once the burial place of kings. Real kings of a real and powerful kingdom whose names ring with the strangeness of the deep Saxon past. And the story of Repton holds, alongside its royal crypt, one of the most chilling archaeological discoveries ever made on English soil. A discovery that reaches back to the coming of the Vikings, and to a winter of slaughter that left its mark in the ground for more than 1,000 years. So let us leave Hexham now, with its Roman stones and its Saxon dark, and let us travel south, to Repton, and to the crypt of the kings of Mercia. Repton is, to look at, a perfectly ordinary English village, with a quiet church and a famous old school, and a sleepy air of having seen nothing more dramatic than a good harvest in 1,000 years. But appearances here are deeply deceptive. For in the early Middle Ages, Repton was a place of the very first importance. It was one of the chief centres of the kingdom of Mercia, which in the 8th century was the most powerful kingdom in all of England, dominating the whole of the Midlands and beyond. And the church at Repton held the royal mausoleum of the Mercian kings, the sacred place where their rulers were laid to rest. Beneath the present church there survives, to this day, a small Saxon crypt, a square stone chamber with a low vaulted roof supported on spiral carved columns, dim and cool and astonishingly old. It was built, in its earliest form, perhaps in the 7th or 8th century, and it became the burial place of Mercian royalty. Here, by tradition and record, were laid kings with names that carry the full, strange music of the Saxon world. Ethelbald, the mighty king who ruled Mercia for 40 years and dominated southern England, killed at last by his own bodyguards, Wiglaf, another king of the line, and most importantly of all, a young royal saint named Wistan. Wistan was a Mercian prince, murdered, the chronicles say, in a dynastic quarrel in the 9th century, struck down treacherously by a kinsman who coveted power. After his death, he came to be venerated as a saint and a martyr, and his body was enshrined in the crypt at Repton. And so, this small stone chamber became not just a royal tomb, but a place of pilgrimage, a holy site where the faithful came to pray at the shrine of the murdered prince. The crypt was altered to accommodate them, with narrow stairways cut so that pilgrims could descend into the sacred space, file past the shrine of the saint, and climb back up again, carrying with them the blessing of their nearness to holy royal bones. You can still see, worn into the stone of those stairs, the evidence of countless medieval feet. In time, as with Hexham, this ancient royal crypt was lost, buried, and forgotten. Beneath the changing fabric of the church, its existence passing out of memory. And then, in the 1700s, it too was rediscovered by accident. The old story once again, a workman digging a grave in the church floor who suddenly broke through into a hidden, vaulted chamber below and found himself in the long-lost mausoleum of the kings of Mercia. Imagine that moment. Imagine being an ordinary labourer, expecting nothing but earth and stone, and instead feeling your tool punch through into emptiness and peering down by candlelight into a 1,000-year-old royal crypt that no living person had entered in centuries. It is the recurring miracle of this story, the breakthrough into the waiting dark, and at Repton it delivered up the burial place of kings. To stand in the Repton crypt today, as you still can, is to stand in one of the oldest intact rooms in England, a space that has survived, against all the odds, since the age when England was not yet England, but a patchwork of warring Saxon kingdoms. The columns rise around you, carved with their spiralling patterns. The low roof presses close, the light is dim and golden, and the air is the cool, still, changeless air of the deep crypt, the same air that has filled this chamber since kings were laid here more than 1,100 years ago. It is a place to make you fall silent and to feel, in a way that no book can give you, the almost unbearable depth of the past beneath your feet. But Repton holds another secret, beyond its royal crypt, and it is a far darker one. For the same wave of history that made Wystan a martyr, the violence and the dynastic murder of the 9th century was about to be utterly overwhelmed by a catastrophe from across the sea. In the autumn of the year 873, a great army of Vikings came to Repton, seized this sacred royal centre of the Mercian kings, and made it their winter camp. And what they did there, and what archaeologists found buried in the ground beside the church more than 1,000 years later, is one of the most extraordinary and chilling discoveries in the whole archaeology of early England. To understand it, we must leave the quiet of the royal crypt and step out into the cold of that terrible winter when the holy place of the Mercian kings became a fortress of the heathen Danes. The army that came to Repton in the year 873 was the force that the English chroniclers called the Great Heathen Army, a vast coalition of Viking warriors that had been ravaging England for years, toppling kingdom after kingdom. They had already destroyed the royal houses of Northumbria and East Anglia. Now they fell upon Mercia, and they chose Repton, the sacred heart of the Mercian monarchy, as the place to spend the winter. It was a calculated insult as much as a strategic choice. By camping in the holiest royal site of the kingdom, they were crushing, they declared, in the most brutal possible terms, that the old order was finished. The Vikings dug a great defensive ditch and rampart, and with grim practicality they built it right up against the church, using the holy building itself as a gatehouse and a strong point in their fortifications. The mausoleum of the Mercian kings, the shrine of St. Wystan, became a corner of a Viking war camp. and during that winter, and in the events surrounding it, a great many people died and were buried at Repton in ways that have given archaeologists an astonishing window into that violent age. In the 1970s and 80s, archaeologists led by Martin Biddle and Bertha Kjølby Biddle excavated at Repton, and what they found has become famous in the study of the Viking Age. Near the church, they uncovered a burial mound, and within it, in a sunken stone structure that had once been a building, they found the jumbled bones of at least 264 people. The bones had been carefully gathered and stacked around a central burial, sorted and arranged in a way that spoke of deliberate ritual. Many of the dead were robust young men, and some showed the marks of violent injury, of wounds taken in battle. Mingled with the bones were Viking objects, weapons, and silver coins that dated the deposit precisely to the time of the Great Army's winter at Repton, the winter of 873 to 874. Here, then, was another kind of sealed and hidden chamber. Not a crypt built for kings, but a charnel mound raised by Vikings, holding the dead of that terrible winter, sealed beneath the earth and forgotten for 1100 years, until careful, modern hands uncovered it. For a long time, there was debate about who exactly these people were and how they had died, whether they were the casualties of battle and disease among the great army itself, gathered together for burial, perhaps around the body of a fallen leader. Modern scientific analysis, the kind of careful work that we will come to shortly, has helped to confirm that many of these dead were indeed of Scandinavian origin, warriors of that very army, laid to rest in the shadow of the church they had seized. Nearby, at a place called Heathwood, there is also a rare Viking cremation cemetery, where the dead were burned in the pagan manner, a thing almost unknown elsewhere in England, further proof of the heathen army's presence in this Christian land. Think, for a moment, of what Repton holds, all in one small and quiet English village. Beneath the church, the intact crypt of the Christian kings of Mercia, with its murdered royal saint, lost and rediscovered by the breaking of a floor. And beside the church, the sealed charnel mound of the pagan Viking army that came to destroy that royal house, holding the bones of hundreds of warriors from across the sea, lost and rediscovered by the careful work of the spade. 2 hidden chambers, 2 sealed deposits of the dead, Christian and pagan, royal and military, separated by the very conflict that created them both, waiting side by side in the dark for more than 1,000 years until the modern age came at last to open them. This is the truth of the sealed places of England, and it is so much richer than any legend of buried gold. It is a truth of kings and saints and warriors, of faith and slaughter, of the deep and tangled roots of this island story, all of it preserved in the cool dark beneath the turf, all of it waiting. And it reminds us that the sealing of a chamber is not only the work of frightened monks in the 16th century, it is something humans have done across all the ages, building places for the dead, closing them, and leaving them to the keeping of the earth. From Repton, let us travel north once more, to a little church on the edge of the Yorkshire moors, where one of the most perfect and complete of all England's ancient crypts still waits at the bottom of its worn stone stair, exactly as it was built more than 900 years ago. The village of Lastingham lies on the southern edge of the North York moors, a remote and beautiful spot where a Christian community has existed since the very earliest days of the faith in northern England. It was here, in the 7th century, that a holy man named Shed founded a monastery, choosing the wild and lonely place deliberately as a fit setting for prayer and penance. Shed died of the plague and was buried at Lastingham, and his grave became a holy site. And in the 11th century, After the Norman conquest, monks returning to refound the monastery built, over the site of the saint's burial, a crypt of extraordinary beauty and completeness which survives, whole and intact, to this day. The crypt at Lastingham is unique in England. It is not merely a vaulted cellar, but a complete tiny church in its own right, with a nave, side aisles, and a rounded apse at the eastern end, all built in heavy, simple Norman stone, the round arches springing from short, thick columns with carved capitals. To descend into it is to enter a complete and self-contained sacred world, low and dim and immensely solid, that has stood unaltered beneath the parish church for more than 900 years. It was built to honour and to hold the relics of Saint Shed, and it carries within its stones fragments that are older still, pieces of Saxon carving from the very first monastery, so that here too, as at Hexham, the layers of the deep past are folded together in the dark. What makes Lastingham so precious is precisely that it was never lost, never sealed up and forgotten, never broken into by a startled workman. It has simply endured, in continuous use and continuous memory, a crypt that has kept its vigil unbroken for nearly a millennium. And it gives us something the rediscovered crypts cannot: a sense of what all those sealed chambers were like before they were sealed, when they were living holy places, full of candlelight and prayer, and the quiet movement of the faithful descending to be near the bones of a saint. When you stand in the Lastingham crypt, you are standing in the medieval world as it was meant to be, the lower church alive and whole, the holy dark serving its sacred purpose. It is, in its quiet way, as moving as any of the dramatic rediscoveries. Beyond these intact survivals, the great ruined abbeys of England hold their own underground worlds, and many of them can still be walked today. At the great Cistercian houses of the north, at Fountains Abbey and Rievaulx, both of them now magnificent ruins in their wooded Yorkshire valleys, you can still descend into the vast vaulted undercrofts that survived the Dissolution, the enormous stone cellars where the monks once stored their wool and their wine and their provisions, running the length of the buildings in row upon row of arches. These are not crypts of the dead, but they are the same kind of deep, cool, enduring underground space, the part of the monastery that was built into the earth, and they have survived precisely because they were so massively constructed that even the determined destruction of the Dissolution could not bring them down. To walk through the undercroft at Fountains is to feel the sheer scale and permanence of the monastic world, the way these places built downward and inward as well as upward, the way they meant to last forever. So we have seen now that the sealed and hidden chamber beneath the English church is no mere legend. We have stood in the Saxon crypt at Hexham, built of Roman stone and lost for 1,000 years. We have descended into the royal mausoleum at Repton and stood beside the Viking charnel mound that waited 11 centuries in the dark. We have entered the perfect Norman crypt at Lastingham and the great undercrofts of the ruined abbeys. These are real places, real survivals, real breakthroughs into the waiting dark, and you can go and stand in them yourself. But there remains a question we have only begun to answer. When such a chamber is opened, when a sealed tomb is breached, or a lost crypt is entered, what is actually found within? What happens to the dead and to the things buried with them in those long centuries of cool and silent waiting? For the answer to that is a strange and sometimes startling thing, and it takes us into the realm of lead coffins and preserved bodies and the curious afterlife of the buried dead. No journey into the sealed and holy dark of England would be complete without a visit to Durham, and to the most famous body in all of English religious history, the body of St. Cuthbert. For Cuthbert's long story, stretching across more than 1,000 years, gathers together almost every thread we have followed tonight: the relic and the shrine, the sealing and the hiding, the open tomb and the astonishing preservation, all in a single, extraordinary tale. Cuthbert was a holy man and bishop of the 7th century, a hermit and a wonder-worker who lived on a lonely island off the Northumbrian coast, and who became, after his death, the most beloved saint of the north of England. He was buried on the holy island of Lindisfarne, and there a remarkable thing was discovered. When his fellow monks opened his grave some years after his death, intending to move his bones to a finer shrine, they found, to their amazement, that his body had not decayed at all. It lay there whole and lifelike, the limbs supple, as though he were merely sleeping. To the medieval mind, this incorruption of the body was the surest possible sign of sanctity, a miracle that proved beyond doubt that this was a man whom God had specially blessed. And from that moment, Cuthbert's body became one of the most sacred objects in all of Britain. Then came the Vikings, the same storm of raiders we met at Repton, and the monks of Lindisfarne were forced to flee their island before the heathen onslaught. And they took Cuthbert with them. For more than 100 years, the community of St. Cuthbert wandered the north of England, carrying the saint's incorrupt body with them in its wooden coffin, from refuge to refuge, never finding a lasting home, guarding their holy treasure through invasion and chaos. It is one of the great epics of early English Christianity, this long wandering of a community defined entirely by its devotion to the body of a dead man. And at last, the wandering ended. The saint, by tradition guiding his bearers himself, came to rest on a great rock in a loop of the River Wear, and there a church was built to house him. And around that church grew the city of Durham, and in time the magnificent cathedral that still stands there today, one of the supreme masterpieces of medieval architecture in all of Europe. Durham Cathedral was built, quite simply, to be a worthy house for the body of St. Cuthbert. The whole vast structure is, in a sense, a single enormous reliquary. For centuries, Cuthbert lay in his shrine behind the high altar at Durham, the focus of one of the greatest pilgrimages in England, his body still believed to be incorrupt within its coffin. And then came the Dissolution, and the king's commissioners arrived at Durham, as they arrived everywhere, to strip the shrine of its gold and its jewels, and to put an end to the cult. They broke open the shrine. And here the story takes its strange turn, for according to the accounts that come down to us, when they opened Cuthbert's coffin, expecting only bones, they found instead the body of the saint still whole, still preserved nearly 900 years after his death. Even these hardened men, sent to destroy the shrine, were said to have been given pause by what they found. The body was not destroyed. It was reburied quietly beneath the place where the shrine had stood. And there Cuthbert remained through all the long centuries that followed, no longer enshrined in gold, but still resting in the heart of his great cathedral. And then, in the year 1827, in the careful, curious spirit of the antiquarian age, the grave was opened once more. Scholars and clergy gathered to see what lay beneath the worn stone, to test the ancient claims, to look upon the saint with their own modern eyes. They dug down, and they found the coffins, one within another, and within the innermost, the remains of St. Cuthbert. By this time, after 1,200 years, the flesh was gone, and only the bones remained, but they were the bones of the saint, lying amid the precious things that had been buried with him across the centuries, fragments of ancient vestments, a small portable altar, a comb, and, most precious of all, a pectoral cross of gold and garnets of exquisite 7th century workmanship, which had lain hidden against his breast, unseen for more than 1,000 years. That cross is one of the great treasures of early English art, and it came back into the light only because the sealed grave was opened at last. Cuthbert's story holds, in a single thread, everything we have been reaching toward. The holy body preserved against all nature in the sealed dark. The relic carried and hidden and guarded through ages of violence. The shrine broken at the Dissolution, and the body saved and reburied rather than destroyed, and the grave opened centuries later to give up its bones and its hidden treasure to the patient eyes of a new age, to stand today in Durham Cathedral at the plain stone slab that marks his resting place, is to stand at the meeting point of all these things, the faith and the fear, the sealing and the finding, the long, long keeping of the dark. And it is to feel, once more, that strange and central truth of our whole story, that beneath the floors of England's holy places, the past is not gone, it is only waiting. When a person of importance was buried in the medieval and later periods in a crypt or a vault beneath a church, they were very often buried in a coffin of lead. Lead was expensive, and it was heavy, and it was used precisely because it endured. A wooden coffin would rot away within a generation or two, but a lead coffin, sealed and solid, would last for centuries, protecting and preserving what lay within. And so the crypts and vaults of England came to hold, alongside the bare bones of the older dead. These heavy metal caskets, sealed shut and astonishingly durable, each one a sealed chamber in miniature within the larger sealed chamber of the crypt itself. What happens to a body inside a sealed lead coffin, in the cool and constant air of a crypt, over the course of centuries, is a strange and sometimes unsettling thing. Sometimes the body simply decays in the ordinary way, leaving clean bones. But sometimes, when the conditions are just right, when the coffin is well sealed, and the temperature is stable, and the chemistry of the body and the air conspire in a particular way, decay is slowed or halted, and the body is preserved, partially mummified, the features still recognizable, the skin like leather, the form of the person held intact for hundreds of years. The antiquarians who opened such coffins, in their reckless and curious way, sometimes found themselves looking into the faces of people who had died 3 or 4 centuries before, faces dried and darkened, but still, unmistakably, faces. There are many recorded instances of this scattered through the history of English churches. Bishops opened in their tombs and found with their vestments intact, the gold thread still gleaming, the ring still on the withered finger, the wooden staff of office, the crozier still lying in the crook of the arm where it had been placed at the funeral. Abbots found in their stone coffins, with the chalice and paten, the sacred vessels of the Mass, buried with them as a sign of their office. Great lords and ladies preserved in their finery, and in the deepest and oldest tombs, the simple, shrouded forms of the holy and the powerful, lying exactly as they had been laid, in a stillness that had lasted longer than the memory of any living thing. There is something profoundly affecting in these moments of opening, and the people who experience them often struggle to describe the feeling. It is one thing to read about the dead of long ago, to know in an abstract way that they lived and died. It is quite another to lift a coffin lid and find them there, physically present, the actual person, the actual face, suddenly and shockingly close across the gulf of centuries. The antiquarians wrote of being moved to silence, to awe, sometimes to a kind of fear, not of ghosts or curses, but of the sheer, overwhelming reality of the past made flesh before them. The sealed coffin, like the sealed crypt, collapses time. It brings the distant dead into the same room as the living, and the encounter is never quite what one expects. This preservation is also a gift to the modern scholar, though we must be glad that the careless openings of the antiquarian age have largely given way to the careful methods of modern archaeology. For a well-preserved body, examined properly, can tell us an enormous amount. It can tell us how the person lived, what they ate, what diseases they suffered, how old they were when they died, sometimes even where they grew up. The vestments and objects buried with them can be studied and conserved, illuminating the crafts and the customs of their age. A sealed tomb, opened with care, is not a treasure chest of gold, but it is something better, a treasure chest of knowledge, a perfectly preserved capsule of a single human life and the world that shaped it. And this brings us to the heart of the matter, to the honest accounting we promised at the beginning. For we have circled all around it now, through the crypts and the coffins and the bone rooms, and it is time to answer plainly the question that hangs over every sealed chamber ever found. What did they truly hold? Not in legend, but in fact. When the wall was broken down, when the lost crypt was entered, when the heavy lid was lifted at last, what was really there? The answer is not the answer the treasure hunters want, but it is, I think, a far more beautiful one. Let us look at it directly, and without illusion, in the cool light of the truth. Let us be honest, then, about the gold, because the legends always promise gold, and we should meet that promise squarely. Did the sealed crypts of England hold treasure? Sometimes, yes. There are real and documented cases of valuable objects hidden in the last days of the monasteries and recovered long after, of caches of silver communion plate buried for safekeeping, of precious objects walled up and forgotten. Recusant families, the Catholics who kept the old faith in secret through the long centuries of persecution that followed the Dissolution, sometimes preserved relics and sacred vessels smuggled out of the dying abbeys, hidden in priest holes and secret chambers in their houses, brought out only for the secret mass. Hidden treasure is not pure fantasy. It is a real, if rare, thread in the story. But it is not the main thread, and anyone who goes looking only for gold will miss almost everything that matters. The overwhelming reality of the sealed chambers is not treasure, but the dead, and the things that belong to the dead. It is bones lying in the dark. It is lead coffins with their preserved and solemn occupants. It is the worn stone of crypts built for prayer. It is, very often, simply emptiness and silence. A chamber that held nothing more than air and the memory of what it had once contained. The commissioners of the Dissolution were thorough. They took the gold. They stripped the shrines. In most places, by the time the doors were shut, there was little left of material value to seal away, only the dead and the holiness and the grief. And here is the thing that the treasure hunter's disappointment conceals. The true contents of these chambers, the bones and the coffins and the worn stone, are worth infinitely more than gold if we know how to value them. A reliquary of beaten gold tells us about the wealth of an abbey. But the bones it once held, studied with care, can tell us who the saint really was, where they were born, what they suffered, how they died. A jeweled shrine is a beautiful object, but a sealed crypt, properly excavated, is a library of human lives, a direct and irreplaceable record of the people of the past, their bodies, their beliefs, their burials, their world. The gold can be weighed and spent. The knowledge cannot be replaced at any price. By the measure that truly matters, the sealed chambers of England are richer than any treasure vault, and they were guarded, in the end, not by curses or conspiracies, but by the simple, patient keeping of the earth. There is also a quieter kind of treasure that these chambers have sometimes given up, and it is one that the monks who did the hiding would have valued above all the gold in the kingdom. Documents, manuscripts, books. For the Dissolution was, among its many other catastrophes, the greatest destruction of books in English history, the scattering and burning of libraries that had been assembled over 1,000 years. And we know that some monks, in their desperation, tried to save what books they could, hiding manuscripts away, smuggling them out, sealing them up. Some of the greatest treasures of English literature and history survive today only because, somewhere in those terrible years, a faithful hand hid a single precious book and trusted it to the dark. Each such survival is a small miracle, a fragment of a drowned world washed up, against all odds on the shore of the present. So the honest answer to the great question is this: the sealed chambers held above all the dead, and the memory of the holy, and here and there a fragment of saved treasure or a single rescued book. They did not, for the most part, hold the dark secrets and the forbidden knowledge of the legends. And yet, and this is the strange and important truth, they do hold something that the legends are clumsily reaching toward. They hold a real lost world. They hold the physical, tangible reality of a way of life that was deliberately destroyed and walled away. An entire spiritual civilization switched off and sealed in the dark. When we break into a sealed crypt, we are not finding a treasure chest. We are finding the corpse of medieval England itself, preserved in the cool and the silence, waiting to tell us who we used to be. And to read that record properly, we need not the pickaxe of the treasure hunter, but the patient, careful, almost reverent tools of the modern archaeologist. Let us see now what those tools can do, and what a sealed chamber can teach us when it is opened not in greed, but in care. When a sealed chamber is opened today by archaeologists rather than by curious antiquarians, the very first thing they think about is not what is inside, but the air. For a chamber that has been sealed for centuries has its own atmosphere, its own microclimate, a pocket of stable, cool, still air that has been undisturbed for a very long time. And it is precisely that stability that has preserved whatever lies within. The moment the seal is broken, fresh air rushes in, carrying moisture and warmth and the spores of decay, and the delicate equilibrium of centuries can be destroyed in hours. Things that have survived intact for 500 years can crumble within days of being exposed. And so the modern archaeologist approaches the breaking of a seal with enormous caution, recording everything, controlling the conditions as far as possible, and trying to lose as little as they can of the fragile information the chamber holds. For information is what they are truly after. A sealed crypt or tomb, to the modern scientist, is a sealed archive of data, and the techniques now available to read that archive would have astonished the antiquarians. The bones themselves can be studied to determine age, sex, height, health, and the marks of a lifetime of labor or ease, the chemistry locked in the teeth. The same isotope analysis we have spoken of before can reveal where a person grew up, drinking the water of one region or another, so that the wanderings of the dead across their lives can be traced across 1,000 years. The bones can be radiocarbon dated, fixing them in time. Ancient DNA can sometimes be recovered, revealing family relationships, ancestry, even the diseases a person carried. A single skeleton, properly studied, can yield a biography of astonishing richness, drawn entirely from the silent evidence of the body. This was exactly the kind of work that transformed our understanding of the dead at Repton. The bones in the charnel mound, long debated, were subjected to modern scientific analysis, to radiocarbon dating, and to the study of the chemical signatures within them. And the science helped to settle the old arguments, confirming that the deposit belonged to the time of the great heathen army, and that many of the dead were indeed of Scandinavian origin, warriors who had come across the sea and died far from home, in the winter camp beside the Mercian church. Without these tools, the charnel mound would have remained a mystery and a guess. With them, it became a precise and powerful window into a single, documented moment of the Viking Age. This is what care can do that greed cannot. The treasure hunter wants the object. The scientist wants the story, and the story is worth far more. The objects buried with the dead are treated with the same care. Textiles, the vestments and shrouds that survive in well-sealed tombs, are among the most fragile and most precious of all finds, for medieval cloth almost never survives above ground, and a sealed coffin may preserve fabrics and embroideries that exist nowhere else. They are lifted with infinite patience, conserved, studied, and they reveal the lost arts of the medieval needle, the dyes and the weaves and the patterns that clothed the living and honoured the dead. Wooden objects, leather, even organic materials like flowers or herbs placed in the coffin can survive in the stable air of a sealed chamber and tell us things about medieval funeral customs that no document records. Every fragment is evidence. Every detail is a sentence in the biography of a vanished world, and so the modern opening of a sealed chamber is a slow, painstaking, almost devotional act, the very opposite of the legend's image of the treasure hunter smashing through a wall by torchlight to seize the gold. It is recording, and sampling, and conserving, and dating, and analysing the patient reconstruction of lost lives from the faint traces they left behind. It does not always make for a dramatic story. There is rarely a glittering hoard, rarely a moment of pure cinematic wonder. But what it produces is something the legend can never give, real and certain knowledge of who these people were, drawn directly from their own remains, recovered from the dark where they have waited so long. Why then do the legends persist? Why, despite all this sober truth, does the image of the sealed crypt continue to glitter in our imagination with promises of treasure and secrets and forbidden things? Why did so many of you, perhaps, click on this very story, half hoping for exactly that, for hidden gold and dark mysteries beneath the Abbey floor? There is a reason, and it is a deeply human one, and it is worth understanding because it tells us something not about the medieval dead, but about ourselves, the living, and about why the sealed door has such an unbreakable hold upon the human heart. There is one more story we must tell before we turn to the legends, and it is perhaps the most famous open tomb in all of English history, because it teaches us a lesson that runs to the very heart of our subject. It is a lesson about how much we want to believe, and about how the desire to find something wonderful in the dark can shape what we think we have found. It takes us to Glastonbury, to the greatest and most legend-haunted abbey in the land, and to a discovery made there not in the modern age, but in the depths of the Middle Ages itself, in the year 1191. Glastonbury was already, by the 12th century, wrapped in an extraordinary tangle of legends. It was said to be the oldest Christian site in Britain, founded, the wilder stories claimed, by Joseph of Arimathea himself, who was supposed to have come to Britain carrying the Holy Grail, and it was associated above all with King Arthur, the legendary British war leader whose tale was, in the 12th century, exploding into popularity across Europe. Glastonbury, some said, was the true site of the magical Isle of Avalon, where the wounded Arthur had been carried after his last battle. These were the kinds of legends that made an abbey famous, and that drew pilgrims and their offerings by the thousand. And then, in 1191, the monks of Glastonbury made an astonishing announcement. While digging in their cemetery, they said, they had discovered, deep in the ground, a great hollowed log coffin, and within it were the bones of a man of enormous size, and beside him the bones of a woman, with a scrap of golden hair that crumbled to dust when it was touched. And most wonderful of all, they had found a leaden cross, buried with the bodies, bearing an inscription that named the dead. Here, the cross declared, lies buried the renowned King Arthur in the Isle of Avalon. The monks had found, they proclaimed, the grave of Arthur himself and of his queen, Guinevere. It was a sensation. It seemed to prove the legends true, to anchor the misty tales of Avalon in solid bones and solid earth, right there in the Abbey grounds. Pilgrims flocked to the new tomb. The fame and the fortune of Glastonbury soared. There was only one difficulty, and it is one that modern historians regard as decisive. The discovery came at a remarkably convenient moment. Just a few years earlier, a great fire had devastated the abbey, and the monks were in desperate need of money to rebuild. A miraculous discovery, proving their most famous legend and drawing pilgrims from across Christendom, was exactly what they needed, exactly when they needed it. And the inscribed lead cross, the crucial piece of evidence, has long since vanished, leaving no way to test it. Almost no serious historian today believes that the monks of Glastonbury truly found the grave of King Arthur. Most believe, gently or otherwise, that the discovery was arranged, that the tomb was, in some sense, made rather than found. And this is the lesson, the necessary caution, at the heart of our whole journey into the dark. The open tomb, the sealed chamber, the breakthrough into the buried past. These things stir something so deep in us, such a powerful longing to touch the legendary and the lost, that we must always be careful. The same hunger that draws us to these stories can also deceive us. People have always wanted the bones in the ground to be the bones of the hero, the saint, the king. They have wanted the sealed chamber to hold the treasure and the secret. And that wanting has, again and again, led them to see more than was there, to believe more than the evidence allowed, sometimes even to manufacture the wonders they long to find. The monks of Glastonbury are not villains in this. They are simply human, caught in the same desire we all feel. The desire for the dark beneath the floor to give up something marvelous, but their story is a warning. When we go down into the sealed places, we must go with open eyes, and we must be as ready to find the ordinary truth as the extraordinary legend. For the ordinary truth, in the end, is the more trustworthy treasure, and very often the more beautiful one. Almost every ruined abbey in England has its legends, and they are remarkably consistent from one end of the country to the other. There is nearly always a tale of a secret tunnel, a hidden passage running underground from the abbey to some distant point, a castle, a manor, another church, a holy well, sometimes for an impossible distance of many miles. There is nearly always a tale of hidden monastic gold, treasure buried by the monks in the last days, never recovered, waiting still beneath the ruins for the lucky finder. And there is very often a guardian for that treasure, a ghostly monk who walks the ruins by night, a curse upon any who would dig too deep, a warning that some things are better left sealed. These legends are, almost without exception, untrue in their particulars. The great tunnels, when they have been investigated, turn out to be drains or cellars, or simply nothing at all, the imagined passages of a story that grew in the telling. The buried hoards are mostly phantoms. The ghostly monks belong to folklore, not to history. And yet, it would be a mistake to dismiss these legends entirely, for they are not lies so much as memories, distorted and dreamlike, of things that were once true. There really were underground spaces beneath the abbeys, the crypts and undercrofts and drains, and it is no wonder that the folk memory transformed them into mysterious tunnels. There really was hidden treasure here and there, in the desperate final days, and it is no wonder that the memory of a few real caches grew into a universal belief in buried monastic gold. And there really was a terrible wrong done in the Dissolution, a violent severing of something sacred, and it is no wonder that the guilt and grief of that act lingered in the landscape as ghostly monks and uneasy curses, the troubled conscience of a nation expressed in folklore. The legends, in other words, are the dream that England dreamed about the thing it had destroyed. They are the emotional residue of the Dissolution, the sense that something precious was hidden and lost, that great secrets were sealed away, that the broken abbeys held more than met the eye. And that sense, that feeling, is not wrong, even if its particular stories are false. Something precious was hidden and lost. Great things were sealed away in the dark. The ruined abbeys do hold more than meets the eye. The legends simply translate that true feeling into the language of treasure and tunnels and ghosts, because those are the images that the human imagination reaches for when it senses, beneath its feet, the presence of a buried and powerful past. And this is why the sealed door has such a hold on us, why stories like this one draw us in, why so many of us feel, watching them, that history is hiding far more than we were told. It is because, in a sense, it is. Not in the way the conspiracy spinners imagine, with deliberate cover-ups and suppressed secrets, but in a deeper and truer way. The past genuinely is mostly hidden from us. The overwhelming majority of everything that ever happened, everyone who ever lived, every life and love and fear and faith of the countless generations before us is lost, sealed away beyond any recovery, gone into a darkness far more total than any walled-up crypt. We stand on the surface of an unimaginably vast buried world, and we feel its presence beneath us, and we are right to feel it. The sealed crypt is simply that universal truth made small and solid and visible, a single door behind which we know, for certain, that the lost past is waiting. Of course it fascinates us. It is the whole mystery of time itself, shrunk down to something we can stand in front of and touch. When we long to open the sealed chamber, then we are longing for something far greater than gold. We are longing to reach back through time and touch the lost world, to recover what cannot be recovered, to stand face to face with the dead and the vanished and the forgotten. It is one of the oldest and deepest of human desires, the desire to defeat time and loss, to bring back what is gone. And the sealed crypt offers us, uniquely, a partial and tantalizing satisfaction of that desire. For here, at least, behind this one door, the past has not entirely vanished. Here it has been kept. And to open it is to win back, just for a moment, a small piece of everything we have lost. That is what we are really reaching for in the dark at the bottom of the stair. Consider for a moment how much of England is built upon this hidden world. There were, before the Dissolution, more than 800 religious houses scattered across the country, in every county, in every kind of landscape, from the great wealthy abbeys of the lowlands to the remote little priories of the moors and the fens. Almost every one of them had its church and its burial places and its underground spaces, and almost every one of them was, in the space of those few terrible years, emptied, stripped, and abandoned, its doors shut, its dark places left to the keeping of the earth. That is a vast inheritance of sealed and forgotten space, scattered the length and breadth of the land, most of it never properly explored, much of it never even located, lying quietly beneath fields and farmyards and the foundations of later houses. Some of these sites are famous ruins, visited by thousands, their stories well known, but many more are almost invisible. A bump in a field, a fragment of wall in a farmyard, a name on an old map, a tradition half remembered in a village. Beneath them, who knows what survives? Crypts that were sealed and forgotten, undercrofts filled with rubble, burials undisturbed since the Middle Ages, perhaps here and there the very things that frightened monks hid in their final hours, still waiting where they were left, in a darkness that has now lasted very nearly 5 centuries. We will never find most of it. It will remain sealed forever, not by any wall, but by the simple fact that we do not know it is there, and have no reason to look. The greatest seal of all is not stone, it is forgetting. And this is the quiet truth that lies at the heart of all our journeys through the medieval past. We walk every day across a buried world. The fields we cross, the towns we live in, the very ground beneath the modern road, all of it rests upon layer after layer of the vanished past, the foundations of the lost, the bones of the forgotten, the sealed and silent remnants of everyone who came before. Most of the time we never think of it. We go about our lives on the bright surface, in the hurry and the noise of the present, and the deep past sleeps undisturbed beneath our feet. But it is there. It is always there. And every so often, a spade goes too deep, or a floor gives way, or a wall turns out not to be the end. And the cool air of the buried world comes sighing up into the light. And for a moment, we remember what we are standing on. So let us return now, at the end of our journey, to where we began, to the imagined crypt beneath the dying Abbey on that cold night in the autumn of 1539. The small group of monks working by candlelight, building their wall, hiding their treasures, sealing the holy dark against the men who were coming in the morning, praying, as they finished, that faithful hands would one day take the wall down again and restore what had been lost. We know now that those hands did not come, not in the way they hoped. The world they were trying to preserve did not return. The wall they built kept its silence for far longer than they could have imagined, for centuries beyond their reckoning, while everyone who knew of it died and was forgotten, and the very memory of the chamber passed out of the world. And yet, in a way they could never have foreseen, something of what they hoped for did come to pass, for the dark did keep what they entrusted to it. The cool, still air did hold the past intact, just as they prayed it would. And eventually, after the long centuries of forgetting, faithful hands did come, not the hands of returning monks, but the hands of those who came to remember and to understand. The careful, patient hands that lift the bones with reverence and read the lost lives written in them, the hands that take down the wall at last, not to plunder, but to know. The monks wanted their world remembered, kept, restored to the light, and though it could not be restored, it can be, and it is, remembered and kept and brought back into the light of understanding. In that sense, and it is not a small one, their prayer was answered after all. Think of them now, the great broken houses scattered across the whole of England, each one keeping its own portion of the dark. Think of fountains in its wooded Yorkshire Valley, the largest monastic ruin in the country, its tower still rising over the river, its vast undercrofts still cool and silent beneath the open sky. Think of Rievaulx nearby, and Whitby on its windswept cliff above the northern sea, and Tintern in its quiet valley on the Welsh border. And Glastonbury, with its tower on the hill, and its bones of legend, and bury St. Edmund's, once one of the richest abbeys in all of Christendom, now a few gaunt fragments standing in a public garden where children play. Think of the hundreds of smaller houses whose names are half forgotten. A priory here, a friary there, a nunnery whose very location is now a matter of guesswork, reduced to a green mound in a farmer's field, or a single carved stone built into a barn. Every one of these places was once a living world, full of prayer and bells and the patient keeping of the dead. Every one of them was emptied and broken in the same few terrible years, and beneath and around every one of them, in greater or lesser measure, the dark still keeps what was left behind. The bones in their forgotten graves, the foundations of the vanished shrines, the sealed and rubble-buried spaces that no one has entered for 500 years. It is a buried kingdom, this scattered inheritance of the dissolved monasteries, an entire lost civilization, folded away beneath the green surface of England, waiting in a silence so deep and so long that it has become almost a kind of peace. We walk above it every day, and only now and then, when a wall gives way or a spade goes too deep, do we remember that it is there at all, holding its breath beneath our feet, patient as the stone, faithful as the dark. And so we arrive, at last, at the answer to the question we set out with, the question that hangs in the air of every sealed chamber, the question so many of us feel without quite knowing why. Why does it always seem as though history is hiding far more than we were told? Now we know. It is because it truly is. Not through conspiracy, not through dark suppression, but through the simple, overwhelming, melancholy fact that the past is mostly lost, that almost everything that ever was has passed into a darkness deeper than any crypt, and that we live, all of us, on the thin, bright surface of an unimaginably vast buried world. The sealed crypt beneath the Abbey is not an exception to this. It is the rule made visible. It is the whole truth of time, shrunk to a single door, behind which the lost world waits. And the deeper answer, the one that should send you gently down towards sleep, is this. The sealed chambers of England were not, for the most part, hiding treasure or secrets or anything that needs to be feared. They were hiding the dead and the holy and the memory of a vanished way of life. They were the work of frightened, faithful people, trying to save what they loved from destruction and trusting the patient dark to keep it safe. And the dark did keep it safe. It is keeping it still. Across all of England, beneath the ruined abbeys and the quiet churches and the ordinary fields, the past is waiting, sealed and silent and patient, exactly as it was left, ready to be remembered whenever we are ready to remember it. The past is deeper than anyone told you. It is stranger and more human and more worth knowing than the tidy version you were given. And it is still there, just beneath the worn stone floor of an old church, behind a wall that should not be there, in a chamber of cool and changeless air that has waited 500 years and would wait 500 more, holding the bones of the holy and the lost, waiting quietly to be properly understood. So let the thought of it carry you down now, gently, into rest. Think of the cool, still air at the bottom of the stair. Think of the candlelight long gone out, and the silence that has lasted centuries, and the dark that has kept the past so faithfully, asking nothing, holding everything, patient beyond all human patience. There is nothing to fear in that dark. It is the dark that keeps. It is the dark that remembers when we forget. It is the same soft, gentle, unhurried dark that is gathering now in the room around you, drawing the day to its close, inviting you down at last into sleep. Until we meet again, in another quiet evening, with another long and gentle journey through the half-remembered corners of the past. May you have peace. May you have rest. May you have all the soft and unhurried hours your heart could ask for. Sleep now. Sleep deeply. Sleep well. Good night. Good night. Good night.